So Dante and Virgilian destiny is what we're on to. Dante and Virgil. We've done the Dark Ages, we've done France in the Middle Ages, we've done the Romance of the Rose, which is one of the three critical medieval texts, if you want to understand literary texts in the Middle Ages, and those three are Romance of the Rose, which we've already seen to, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which we will get to, and then Dante's Divine Comedy, which we'll discuss here. But Dante's Divine Comedy is the grandest of them all. It's the one with the widest scope, it's the one with the greatest ambition. And that ambition really, in terms of the classical tradition, is bridging a Greco-Roman ideal and fusing it into the Christian worldview in which Dante lived. And it's not a coincidence that this happens shortly after Thomas Aquinas manages to do it through Aristotelian reconciliation with gospel, or with the Bible. So Dante himself, what did he think of the pagans, and why he spends a lot of time talking about their souls in his descent through hell, and also through his choice of guides, through who he sees there. He sees a lot of figures from antiquity. To him, the pagan part of man, particularly in the Greco-Roman sense of those pagans, they were a necessary step in man's climb towards the revelation of Christ. Without the step taken by the likes of Virgil and Aristotle, Statius, etc., man would not be in the situation would not have the spiritual sentiment to understand or receive the revelation in the manner in which it appeared. This is Dante's thoughts with regards to the pagans. So he's hoping to attain, through the Divine Comedy, and the journey he goes through in the Divine Comedy, the highest form of beauty, thought, that is possible for man as he contemplates the universe. And to do that, you need to go through the torments of hell, purgatory, and then you need to gain acceptance to heaven. It's interesting that it's similarly like the way he's looking back at these great texts, like Virgil's Aeneid, of course, is key to his understanding of the Divine Comedy, because Virgil is his guide, and the quest that Aeneas goes on to found Rome is kind of, there are parallels with how Dante sees his quest to attain the highest form of beauty and truth. But it's interesting that he needs to be granted attainment to heaven. So despite all of this, the will is still a little bit lacking, in that he's removed from being able to seize his destiny. Attainment to heaven is granted to you, similarly to how Aeneas' destiny is foisted upon him, and he learns it, rather than him going out to seek it and to will his destiny onto the world. Now, the structure for the poem is also of interest, because it gives us an indication of the time and understanding of the ancient texts that people had around Dante's time, calling it the comedy. So the reasoning behind choosing the title, the comedy, is explained in his letter to Can Grande della Scala. He states that the work is going to be a poetic narrative that begins harshly and ends happily. Written in a humble and unpretentious way, which is why he goes for the Italian rather than the Latin, which would have been done by, we see Petrarch try some in the Latin, and it would have been more traditional to have done something like this in the Latin. So in this sense, Dante's understanding of comedy, it's an antithesis to tragedy. That's how he understands comedy, and because of the eventual attainment to heaven at the end of it, he calls it a comedy, because he goes, well, this is not a tragedy. That understanding, so tragedy for him begins in sort of promise and joy and ends in horror. Dante is going to invert that, and he's going to begin with horror and end with joy and beauty and truth. So it's a garbled interpretation of the sort of types of verse drama we see in Aristotle's Poetics. So it's a sort of, you can see in the Middle Ages there's still this misunderstanding of exactly how the ancients constructed work. This tragedy, comedy dichotomy is a false dichotomy, but it is how Dante understands it. So within his own view of the world, his choice of comedy is sound. So we mentioned there that he chose a humble language. He wanted to choose Italian. So to do that, I think what he wanted to do, he wanted this to be penetrated by readers who realized that the Divine Comedy had something to speak to them. That perhaps at this point, Latin had Latin had served its role as being educator. We saw in the Dark Ages with Bede that his ecclesiastical history is written in Latin because Latin is the education language. Dante here wants to, by the late 1200s, early 1300s, wants to turn sort of that idea of Latin being the educator because it becomes so stultified that Italian would be the greater educator and that it would reach more people and they would see it as being applicable to them here and now, whereas Latin had already begun to get that idea of the grand style and something which was perhaps an ape of the past, or else so grand as to be a tier removed from the ordinary reader, whereas Dante wants the ordinary reader to get to realize that the Divine Comedy is written for them. We also see that in terms of pure vocabulary, Virgil carries greater vocabulary in his work than Dante decides for this one. So that's another thing that feeds into that idea. So he has this aspiration for the masses, and it lends it to another possibility of differentiating between his own work as a comedy and the work of Virgil as a tragedy. So Virgil's work was purposefully for the Roman nobility, linking, as he did, Augustus's Rome and its rulers all the way back to Aeneid. So he's using Virgil as a guide, but he's also highlighting to us really how his stuff is not the work of Virgil. His stuff is the work of a Christian worldview. He's creating a bridge between the old world and his world. This is Dante, through his Divine Comedy. So Virgil will go for the nobility, I'll go for the masses. And I'll be able to bridge them together by having Virgil be my guide. So the subject matters about guides and guidance then. The events do mirror the Aeneid and wider Greco-Roman mythos insofar that the protagonist gets sort of transported to the underworld. The ideas of the underworld we see it in the Odyssey when Odysseus needs to descend. We see it, I think it's book 11 in the Odyssey. Certainly book 6 in the Aeneid. Subject matter and events of the poems do kind of mirror the Aeneid insofar that Dante's descent to the underworld is very similar to in this depiction to the descent of the underworld of Aeneid in book 6 of the Aeneid, Virgil's Aeneid. Now, Virgil himself, of course, took that in turn from Homer's Odyssey, which hopefully everyone has now had a go through, because we've gone through the parts of the Odyssey in the Dark Age. So you should be building this up now. We're moving on to the Aeneid in terms of our classical approach, but you need to remember the sort of works of the Odyssey as you go on. So Virgil learns from Homer, and now Dante is learning from Virgil. And his use of Virgil, and later Statius, as guides through the Inferno and Purgatorio, are illustrative that Dante is using past poets as a guide. So, although they don't have the revelation, they're still on the chain of guidance and intergenerational understanding that Dante felt was necessary to put in there. So he's working in a literary tradition that he realizes, even though his own worldview is very different to their own, he needs to work from them. He needs to work in a direct descendant line from the great literary authors of the past. Virgil, Statius, etc. The choice of Beatrice is also a notable choice. He's used his guides from pagan antiquity, Virgil, Statius, and he now wants to demarcate his work from them by saying, you've been my guides, but now I'm going to strike out and do something on my own. So he's going to choose Beatrice, and he's going to Christianize his work. He's going to elevate his work from his own point of view. And she brings him upwards to the outer territories of the Prima Mobile and delivering him to Paradiso. So this element of layering Christianity on top of the pagan guides is what sends him into Paradiso. Greater focus with regards to the classical influence should be on the choice specifically of Virgil. Our imagery of the Divine Comedy is filled with Dante and Virgil going through hell, going through the Inferno. So the Latin poet may not deliver Dante to his final destination, but he does bring him through the most evocative and the most memorable, I suppose, vivid, visceral parts of his journey. Virgil's the bridge between paganism and Christianity. We have to remember that. Remember his fourth eclogue, the prophetic eclogue from the Bucolics, written about 40 years before Christ, in which he has this prophetic dream or this prophetic vision of the coming of a savior that's going to be born and herald a new golden age. That's why Dante feels far more comfortable using him. That's why the church were happy with Dante using him and happy to propagate the work. The choice of Virgil made sense in their own worldview. He's a Christian before Christ. That's what Virgil is, sort of. It was also an opinion strongly encouraged by St. Augustine. So we need to ignore the fact that Virgil was probably genuinely talking about Octavian and the coming of the Roman Empire. But from the Christian point of view, that's what they were talking about. Although the choice of Virgil seemed sound because of the prophecy, it's actually more beneficial to look into the forecoming of Christ through Virgil's Aeneid in terms of its themes and the virtues he wants to espouse in its hero, rather than explicit prophecies and miracles. It's actually a more interesting and a more worthwhile venture to see the Aeneid and the epic of the Aeneid as a world that is approaching Christ, or approaching the idea that something like Christ could be even worshipped. So the character of Aeneas, he's very different to the sort of characters and heroes you see in Homer. We've got, Achilles is angry. Odysseus is wily, he's tricky. He's known to be a cunning man. Aeneas is pious. Above all, he is a pious man. So Virgil as a poet is passionate to that ideal that Aeneas will embody everything that society needs and wants through his journey and his construction of Rome. He's refined on sexual matters. Take in the case with Dido. He has a strong belief in sweeping destiny. And, he also has this idea that he could create a kingdom now, or see through citizens into a kingdom, such as Christ is a gateway to the kingdom of heaven. So, as Homer is to Beowulf, but Virgil is to Homer in terms of the type of characters they're telling and the further away the stories are getting from man simply just grappling with the elements of nature around him, or grappling for that first tier, that first tranche of power, such as seizing a city like Troy in a war ostensibly begun by the kidnapping of a bride. There's stuff to be teased out there, like how do you treat yourself when you're a host? How do you behave? We see this a lot in Telemachus in the Odyssey as well, when he's going about visiting Nestor and visiting Menelaus. How he behaves is certainly in the hall of Menelaus is compared to how Paris had behaved. But they're still sort of fleshing out the rules. It's still very much chaos can erupt quite quickly, as what happens on Ithaca without Odysseus. Whereas through Virgil and through the Aeneid, Virgil wants to tell us of how we got from that world of Troy to Rome, where actually, it can withstand, Rome can, as a society, can withstand the absence even of the great ruler. It can have a Caligula and still go on for another 100 years. It's that self-confidence of that society that Virgil wants to bring across. That idea that, Rome has entered a new phase. So, as Homer was to Beowulf, Virgil is to Homer. And in this sense, again, Dante thinks he is on top of Virgil. That's where he's placing the Divine Comedy, in that chain. And that also lends itself nicely to the understanding of to the understanding of the great chain of being, which was a very sort of entrenched Christian worldview and medieval worldview. So it makes sense with the time in which Dante is sculpting the work. So we mentioned there that Virgil instills in Aeneas a sense of destiny. So I just wanted to talk about some stuff that is maybe not talked about as much around Virgil and his implications on Dante. And it's actually Virgil's imperialism, his patriotism, and those feelings in the context of Dante. So when Virgil is elevating Aeneas and his destiny as rival, it's a lived, but it's also an idealized heralding of the Roman Empire. And that it's the growth of empire, it's the progeny of empire, it's the seeds of commonwealth, as the famous Joseph Conrad saying goes. But the empire that Virgil is heralding to Dante is just as important for the coming of Christ. Without the Roman Empire coming into existence as it did, the way in which Christ revealed himself in the Holy Land and after the Roman conquest of that land, it is completely dependent on there being a Roman Empire. It's dependent on there being that sense of imperium in which Virgil lived first, before we can get to Christ. So Dante sees that. And this view of the role of Rome, of course, then Paul goes back to Rome and uses the seat of that empire in which to propagate the word of Christ. So the Rome seat is used as a vessel by propagators of the Christian faith. So these are elaborated in Dante's De Monarchia, that idea of Rome being inextricable from Christendom. And it's also originally why the seat in Rome is such a holy thing. We saw it go to Avignon, and then it came back. It came back to Rome. Always calling back to Rome is that the seat of the papacy. So acknowledged in the formation of the Roman Empire, was instrumental to Dante's interpretation of the spread of God's will. That's what we have. Virgil then is the necessary pagan to guide Dante through the Inferno. Okay, we have a decent understanding of why that's the case now. You can go all the way to the lowest circle of hell, and what do we find there? Not just traitors to God, but traitors to God, Christ, and also the empire, the Roman Empire. Very interesting. These are the people, the traitors who are kept in the devil's company. Those who threaten the empire's very existence, threaten the eventuality of Christian superiority, and hence are on a par with those who threaten God and Christ himself. That's why Dante puts such a high place in hell for Brutus, Cassius. These are the murderers of Caesar. These are the people who wanted to stall the creation of the empire. And so they're there, right next to Satan, right next to Judas Iscariot. Dante's affiliation with Virgil is also one of patriotism. So we've touched there upon the importance of Virgil's imperialism. What about his patriotism? They're different things. Imperium is the love for imperium rather it's the love for wanting to propagate your greatness onto the world. It's this idea that you are destined for something great that needs to be wide. It's sort of an exothermic reaction of the mind, of the will. Whereas patriotism is much more embedded in the land. Patriotism is a calling for home. So this aspect is there in Virgil. The outward aspect is there in the Aeneid. The inward love of the heart and home, that's there in the Georgics. That's there in the Bucolics. And that love of Italy, of course we must remember Virgil is a Mantuan, and Dante takes that love of Italy and he sees then and compares it to the state of Italy's gloomy disposition. This is talked about in the Purgatorio. He was the Mantuan, here's the Mantuan Sordello, embrace the ancient Mantuan Virgil, and hails the pagan poet as il nostro maggior poeta. That idea of identity and identifying with Virgil as one of ours, even though he was, the Roman society and that in which Dante inhabited were quite different. He's still one of ours. It's because of that heart and home. It's because of the Georgics. Had Virgil only done the Aeneid, that sense of connection is perhaps not there as strongly. Now, if Dante wanted to let reason guide him through hell and purgatory before reaching hell, as is often stated, would it not make sense to have chosen, he would have chosen an Aristotle, the master of those who know. Yet, to Aristotle, Dante doesn't even speak to him. The reason is there. There's an element to Aristotle that is inherently foreign to Dante. They're masters of different tongues, both in interpretation and in style. One must remember that Dante is preoccupied with northern Italian strife of the Guelphs and Ghibellines, and that his poem is decidedly written in Italian and was decidedly written for Italians. They're not going to have that connection with Aristotle as the same as what they have for Virgil. So Aristotle was not what was required, it was Virgil. So the comedy's structure and style. What does Dante take from Virgil in terms of style? On the surface, not much. Virgil wrote his Aeneid in hexameter, same as Homer. Dante opts for terzo rima in hendecasyllables, so A, B, A, B, C, B, D, C, D, and so on, which is it's an elaboration of a Provençal pattern. And I think, as we discussed earlier, the Provençal is sort of the medieval minstrel, the troubadour. It's not really a classical style. Sometimes it gets fused in with the tradition indirectly, because it was just the floating about milieu. But it's more important to rhyme in a style of Dante that's imitative of the Trinity. The terzo rima is imitative of the Trinity. And we see again this idea of needing to split it in terms of three. There's 3 books. There's 33 cantos in each book. The first one has an extra canto, simply an introductory canto, but the heart of it has 33. And any incorporation of Virgilian meter would have ruined that sense of the Trinity that Dante's going for there. And it also would have been out of sync with Dante's understanding of tragedy. Again, remember, he thinks Virgil is tragedy, and he thinks he's going to write a comedy, which is the antithesis to tragedy. So he's not going to write it in hexameter. It does remain, though, unique passages, which you can see the influence of Virgil. An example occurs in Inferno 13, where the 2 poets enter a wood, where the trees bleed when broken because they contain the souls of suicides. This is an direct imitation of Aeneid Book 3. In Aeneid Book 3, Virgil describes Aeneas's reaction to breaking the branch. Chill horror shook my limbs and cold fear froze my blood. Dante's version is far plainer and simpler in description. I let the twig fall, stood like the man who is afraid. Dante's obfuscation of the ornate is again in tune with wanting to write a comedy, as he understands it. But the influence is there. Inferno 13, Aeneid 3, the breaking of the branch, and also the blood of suicides seeping through the wood. So where Dante does show the classical qualities is in his reaction to the study of Virgil. Guido Cavalcanti, contemporary of Dante, described the comedy as perhaps despising Virgil. Dante wishes to emphasize his stand with pagan poetry as isolating, even solitary, but he also wishes to display qualities of grandeur, imagination, that sustain the nobility of thought. So, they're essential Virgilian qualities. The qualities Dante wants to espouse are Virgilian qualities. And he's constantly comparing himself to those of Rome. Not just because Rome was near to hand. Not just because Rome was the first thing he thought of. Rome is the greatest thing he thought of. That's why he's comparing to Rome. You know, Aeneas is like Paul. So, there's certainly no despising of Virgil going on here. Yeah, before entering the underworld, to Virgil's summoning, he is insistent that he is neither Aeneas or Paul. He actually mentions that. His fear in dropping the branch, revealing a protagonist contemplating his inability to achieve the greatness of his models. Remember this, like the holding of the golden bough. It's like, I'm going to drop this because I'm not worthy of them. I'm not worthy of following these people in the sort of journeys that they've had. I'm not capable of having such a similar one. Perhaps there's elements there of his inability to create reconciliation. He lived in the time of the Guelph-Ghibelline strife. That would seem quite irreconcilable, and so he also has his own internal irreconcilabilities. So Virgil had added to Homer's world. I've already mentioned that, but what more specifically did he add? He added more sort of mythical ideas. Orpheus, Plato, Platonism. Dante saw it as his duty to add to Virgil's attempt to fill the vague aspects of the underworld. So, to this, Dante uses geographical moralism, using Thomas Aquinas' elaborations on Aristotle and the arrangement of the vices. So elsewhere, supernatural inhabitants from the classical world are abundant. You know, Dante's Inferno, ferryman Charon, the judge Minos, the fiendish dog Cerberus, harpies, the centaurs, they're all there. It's probably an inexhaustible list. Well, it is exhaustible, but it's inexhaustible for the time in which I would want to say it. And as the comedy then proceeds towards the divine, Dante naturally utilizes less and less of these classical works. So he's linking the geographical descent through hell and then eventually his emergence from it with the progress of time, the timeline and the elevation of Christ. In Purgatorio, the cardinal sins find themselves represented by the biblical figures. You know, we've got Nimrod, Niobe, Saul, Arachne. Cato remains as a guardian of purgatory. His position between Dante's hell and purgatory is consistent with the position as being in Virgil's idea of heaven, as described in the Aeneid, Book 8. So that's sort of an interesting consistency that he wants to go for. It's like, well, relative to me being Dante, Virgil would have placed Cato here, so at the top of his worldview, so I'm going to place him here in my worldview, and as I'm going through, I will pass through the same point. Cato's going to stay on the exact same point, and the only thing that's changing is myself and Virgil's understandings of just how high man can be attained in heaven. So let's just talk a little bit about the Aristotelian framework then, because there is a decent element of Aristotle here, and we should probably just flesh that out a bit. Aristotle's sins were divided threefold: incontinence, which is uncontrolled desires; bestiality, which is sort of a perverted desire; and then a vice, which is the genuine abuse of reason. And Dante divides his hell into three groups: incontinence, violence, deceit. These are obviously mirroring that of Aristotle. And as is the mark of Plato's division of the soul, in Dante's ascent to heaven, Platonic soul has three elements: that which desires, that which is spirited and energetic, and that which thinks. The classical philosophers never left those the poet. Dante knew about Aristotle and Plato throughout his composition, and it was key to his orchestration of it. Virgil may guide him through hell, but it has been undeniably morally sculpted by the likes of the Greek philosophers Aristotle, Plato. Dante completes his journey through hell and purgatory to heaven with a resounding choir of angels, crying, Benedictus qui venis, blessed art thou who comest. The greeting of the multitudes, it's the same as that which Jesus gets as he enters Jerusalem. Notably followed by Manibus date lilia plenis. Give me from full hands lilies, the tribute of Anchises to the spirit of Marcellus in the Aeneid. So he has linked quotes there from the Bible straight into the Aeneid. And as we mentioned earlier, the Aeneid is preparing ourselves for the revelation of Christ in terms of hero worship. So by this tribute, Dante really has achieved the idea of his work. His attainment to heaven happens just as he links through those lines the coming of Christ into Jerusalem, and then lines written by Anchises in the Aeneid. So, apart from the aforementioned Virgil and Aristotle, there are some other classical influences, which I'll just go through here quickly. Ovid, as mentioned in the last one. Ovid's metamorphoses were an endless plethora of Roman mythos, sort of a great categorization of mythos. We have Lucan, we have Cicero, both of whom are referenced, quoted some 50 times each. Boethius, of course, is there, stalwart of dark Middle Age scholarship. Statius, Latin poet, who came closest to the achievements of Virgil in Dante's eyes, and that's why he has him as a guide for a brief spell. So the incorporation of these authors are critical to Dante's idea of equaling them. He needs to show himself well read so to have been able to list a decent few of them. It's not good enough just to have Virgil. You need to show that you understand the world, the pagan worldview. You need Lucan, you need Cicero. And it's interesting also the earnestness of those that he chooses. Satirists, your Prudentius, Horace, Juvenal, are not given the same level of credence. These are lesser poets of Rome, as Dante sees it. It's interesting because whether you agree with his distinction or not, Horace is pretty well known, possibly the most well known Roman poet apart from Virgil, but he is less revered because Dante has differentiated his style, and so whether you agree with it or not, at least he has differentiated that style. So that in and of itself shows an understanding of Roman literature, where we are in the Middle Ages. We're coming towards the Renaissance, and we have a greater understanding of things like this. So that's Dante's Divine Comedy. That is his link with Virgil, his link with the classics.